Amina was a young girl with dreams as vast as the open sky. She lived in a small but cozy home with her mother, who was her greatest source of love and strength. Their bond was unbreakable, built on years of trust, laughter, and shared hardships. Though they did not have much wealth, they were rich in the warmth of each other's company. Every morning, Amina would wake up early to help her mother with household chores before rushing off to her classes. She was passionate about education, believing that knowledge was the key to a better future. She often spoke of her dreams of becoming a lawyer, someone who could fight for justice and help those who could not help themselves. Her mother, always encouraging, would smile and tell her that she was destined for greatness. Evenings were the most cherished moments of their day. They would sit together in their small courtyard, drinking tea and sharing stories. Her mother would recount tales from her youth, filling their home with laughter and nostalgia. Amina loved these moments, believing that nothing could ever come between them. But beneath this happy existence, there were whispers that Amina did not hear. Unseen forces were shaping her fate, deciding a future she would have never chosen for herself. In the shadows, a decision had already been made, one that would soon tear her world apart. Uncle Bashir was a man known for his cunning ways and hunger for wealth. He had always been an opportunist, finding ways to exploit those around him for his own gain. Amina's father, Ibrahim, was no exception. Weighed down by financial troubles, Ibrahim had fallen deep into debt, borrowing money to keep the household afloat. Uncle Bashir saw this as the perfect chance to tighten his grip on his brother-in-law, offering a solution that would rid him of his burden, but at a terrible cost. Late one evening, in the dim glow of an oil lamp, Uncle Bashir sat across from Ibrahim, speaking in a hushed yet persuasive tone. He presented an offer. A wealthy but disabled man named Hakim was looking for a wife. If Ibrahim agreed to marry Amina to him, all his debts would be erased, and he would even receive a generous sum as a gift. Bashir made it sound like an opportunity rather than a betrayal, twisting his words to make it seem like he was doing Ibrahim a favor. At first, Ibrahim hesitated. He loved his daughter and knew this decision would crush her spirit, but the weight of his debts was unbearable. If he refused, their home could be taken from them, and the family would be left with nothing. Slowly, doubt and desperation took root in his mind. The thought of financial relief overpowered his fatherly instincts, and he finally gave in. The deal was struck. Amina would be married off without her knowledge or consent. Meanwhile, her mother remained unaware of the storm brewing within their home. She had always trusted Ibrahim to make the right choices for their family. She believed in his love for their daughter and had no reason to suspect that he could ever betray her. She carried on with her days, blissfully unaware that the fate of her only child had been sealed behind closed doors. Amina's future had been sold away in a single conversation, and she had no idea that the life she had dreamed of was about to shatter before her eyes. The evening air was thick with murmurs, voices lowered in secrecy as Amina passed by the corridor. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something about her father's hushed tone made her stop. Peering from the shadows, she caught fragments of the conversation. Her name, marriage, and a man she had never met. A chill ran down her spine. The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong to her life, yet here they were, weaving a fate she hadn't chosen. Heart pounding, she stepped forward, her voice shaking as she confronted her father. "What are you talking about, Baba?" Her father stiffened, caught in the act of planning her future without her. Uncle Bashir, who was seated beside him, merely smirked and looked away. Ibrahim sighed, avoiding her gaze. "It's decided, Amina. You are to be married. This is for the best." Amina's world tilted. Married? To whom? Why? I don't want this. Her voice cracked, panic rising like a storm inside her. Her father's expression hardened. "You don't have a choice." Tears welled in her eyes. "Baba, please. I have dreams. I want to study. You will have a good life," he interrupted. though his voice lacked conviction. "Your husband is wealthy. He will take care of you." Amina shook her head, unable to believe what she was hearing. "I don't care about wealth. What about my happiness? What about Mama? Does she even know?" At this, Uncle Bashir chuckled, stepping in. "Your mother. No need to worry about her. She'll believe what we tell her. She thinks you're going to visit relatives for a few weeks. By the time she knows the truth, it will be too late." Amina's stomach twisted. They had planned everything so carefully, ensuring her mother remained in the dark. She turned to her father one last time, hoping for a glimmer of compassion, but his face was a mask of guilt and resignation. The following days passed in a blur. The preparations were rushed, leaving her no time to think, let alone escape. Before she could process what was happening, she found herself adorned in bridal clothes, the weight of gold jewelry feeling heavier than shackles. Her mother, unaware of the truth, had been sent away on an errand, leaving Amina alone to face her fate. As the wedding ceremony began, her heart screamed for someone to save her. But no one came. Amina sat motionless as the women around her worked in quiet efficiency, adjusting her bridal attire, fastening heavy gold bangles around her wrists, and securing an elaborate veil over her head. The fabric felt suffocating, the weight pressing down on her, like the reality she was being forced to accept. She could hear their whispers, murmurs about how lucky she was, how fortunate her husband was to have found such a young and beautiful bride. Lucky. The word made her stomach churn. She stared blankly into the mirror before her. The girl reflected in the glass looked like a stranger, draped in red and gold, her face painted with kohl and rouge. Yet her eyes were lifeless. There was no joy, no anticipation, only silent agony, trapped behind the heavy ornaments of celebration. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Uncle Bashir speaking in hushed tones to the guests who had been invited. Only a handful of men, trusted enough to keep the event a secret. The secrecy of it all made Amina feel even more like a prisoner, like someone being buried alive with no one to hear her screams. Her mother should have been here. She should have been the one fixing Amina's veil, placing a kiss on her forehead, offering comforting words. But she wasn't. The excuse had been simple, an urgent errand, something that needed her immediate attention, a distraction carefully planned to keep her away until it was too late. Amina clenched her fists in her lap, her nails digging into her palms as she held back the sobs threatening to escape. Soon she was led into the room where the nikah ceremony would take place. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, the low hum of religious recitations filling the space. Her husband-to-be sat at the far end, a man she had never met, his face partially obscured by the candlelight. He did not look at her, nor did he speak. The Qazi cleared his throat, reciting the words that would bind her to this fate. Her father spoke on her behalf. "Kubul hai," he said. Amina remained silent. "Amina," the Qazi called again, looking at her expectantly. Her throat was dry, her hands trembling as the pen was placed before her. The ink on the marriage contract was fresh, awaiting her signature, awaiting her submission. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she lifted her hand, her fingers feeling foreign as they gripped the pen. With a single stroke, her name was etched onto the paper, sealing a future she never wanted. The room erupted into quiet congratulations, but to Amina, it felt like mourning. Amina sat stiffly on the edge of the grand bed, her bridal veil still draped over her shoulders. The room around her was nothing like the small, familiar space she had called home. The carved wooden furniture, the chandeliers casting golden light, the velvet curtains, all of it screamed of wealth. Yet, none of it made her feel safe. She glanced toward the man who now, by force of ink and spoken vows, was her husband. Hakim sat across from her in his wheelchair, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. He was not old, as she had feared, perhaps in his late 20s, but his face bore the weight of years spent in silent suffering. He did not look cruel, nor did he seem triumphant, as if he had won a prize. Instead, his expression was unreadable, his dark eyes watching her with something that almost resembled guilt. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice calm but distant. "No one will hurt you here." Amina's jaw clenched. "I'm already hurt." Hakim sighed, looking away. "I know." His words did nothing to soothe the burning resentment inside her. How could he claim to understand? He sat in luxury, surrounded by servants and endless wealth, while she had been ripped from her home, her mother, her dreams. Her father had sold her, and this man, whether willingly or not, had been the one to buy her. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. "I didn't ask for this either," Hakim finally admitted, his voice softer this time. "But there are things beyond my control, just as they were beyond yours." Amina swallowed the lump in her throat, refusing to believe him. She didn't care if he was kind or if he pitied her. He was part of this prison, and she would never accept it. That night, when the house finally fell silent, she rose from the bed and tiptoed toward the door. She tried the handle, locked, the windows, too high. She moved to the hallway, her heart hammering, but just as she turned a corner, she froze. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their expressions blank, but their presence clear. She was being watched. Amina's fists clenched at her sides. She had been a fool to think she could simply walk out of this place. They had taken every precaution, ensuring she had nowhere to run. But she wouldn't give up. No matter how heavily guarded this house was, no matter how impossible it seemed, she would find a way to escape. Amina's mother, Farida, stepped into the house with a tired but contented smile, expecting to hear her daughter's cheerful voice greeting her. But the house was silent. Too silent. She set down her shopping bag and called out, "Amina?" No response. Frowning, she walked toward Amina's room, pushing open the door. The bed was neatly made, the books on her shelf untouched, and her clothes still hanging in the closet. Something was wrong. Amina never left the house without telling her. Her heart pounded as she rushed to find Ibrahim. She found him sitting in the courtyard, sipping tea, as if nothing had changed. "Where is Amina?" she asked, breathless. Ibrahim barely looked up. "She's gone." A cold dread settled over her. Gone where? He took another sip before answering. "She left for further studies." It was a sudden decision, but a good one. A wealthy benefactor offered her a scholarship abroad. She agreed immediately. Farida stared at him in disbelief. "She would never leave without telling me." "She tried to, but there was no time," he said, avoiding her gaze. "The arrangements were made quickly. She didn't want you to worry." Farida shook her head. None of this made sense. Amina had always been open with her. She would have never hidden such a big decision. And why hadn't she called? "Where is her phone?" she demanded. She left it behind. That was the final confirmation that something was terribly wrong. Amina would never go anywhere without her phone. Farida's fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "You're lying." Ibrahim's jaw tightened. Farida, let it go. But she couldn't. A mother's heart knew when something was wrong. That night, as Ibrahim slept soundly beside her, Farida sat awake, staring at the ceiling. She replayed every moment, every word, every excuse he had given. The pieces didn't fit. Determined, she decided she would search for the truth herself. She would ask the neighbors, Amina's friends, anyone who might have seen or heard something. She had no idea that her search would put her in danger. Someone was watching, and they didn't want her to know the truth. Days passed, but to Amina, time felt frozen. Each morning, she woke up in the same luxurious prison, surrounded by walls that gleamed with wealth but suffocated her with their confinement. The doors remained locked, the guards ever present, and the reality of her forced marriage loomed over her like a storm cloud that would never clear. She refused to speak to Hakim, treating him with the same cold silence she had given her father before being taken away. To her, he was just another part of the conspiracy, a man who had willingly participated in robbing her of her freedom. Every time he tried to talk, she turned away. Every time he reached out, she stepped back. But Hakim never raised his voice. He never demanded anything from her. Instead, he remained patient, watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. One afternoon, as she sat by the window, staring at the world she could no longer be a part of, he spoke from behind her. "You think I wanted this?" She stiffened, but didn't turn around. "I didn't ask for this marriage any more than you did." His voice held no anger, only quiet resignation. "I know you hate me. I don't blame you, but you should know I had no choice either." Amina clenched her fists. "You're lying." "No," he said softly. "I'm not." Against her better judgment, she finally turned to face him. For the first time, she looked beyond the man she had labeled as her captor and saw something else: sadness. Over the next few days, she began to notice things she had ignored before. The way the servants spoke to him, with the careful tone of people who pitied their master. The way he avoided Uncle Bashir, as if he despised him just as much as she did. The way his own father spoke about him when he thought Hakim wasn't listening, like he was a burden rather than a son. One evening, while she sat in the library, she overheard two maids whispering. If it weren't for this marriage, the master would have lost everything. His father threatened to disown him. "He's lucky this girl was desperate enough to be sold off," the other muttered. Amina's breath caught in her throat. So that was it. Hakim was a prisoner too. His wealth was not his own. His power was an illusion. Just like her, he was trapped in a life he had never chosen. For the first time since the wedding, doubt crept into her anger. Perhaps she had been wrong about him. Perhaps they were both victims in a game played by men far more ruthless than either of them. Amina sat in the dimly lit courtyard, her fingers tracing patterns on the cool marble floor. Days had blurred into nights, and every passing moment felt like another thread tying her deeper into this unwanted life. She had almost given up until she met Zubaida. Zubaida was a quiet, sharp-eyed servant who had been working in Hakim's household for years. Unlike the other servants who either avoided Amina or looked at her with pity, Zubaida seemed to see something in her that others didn't. One evening, as Amina sat alone, Zubaida approached with a tray of tea. Instead of walking away after setting it down, she hesitated. "You shouldn't stop fighting," she whispered. Amina's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Zubaida glanced around to make sure they weren't being watched. "I know you didn't choose this life," she murmured. "And I know you want to leave." Amina's eyes widened. No one had ever acknowledged it so openly before. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you help me?" Zubaida hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I can try, but it's dangerous." Hope flickered in Amina's chest, fragile but alive. She reached for the one thing she had been longing to do since the day she was taken: send a message to her mother. That night, she tore a piece of paper from a book and wrote with shaking hands, "Mama, I did not leave. I was taken. Baba lied to you. Please, find me." She folded the note carefully and pressed it into Zubaida's palm. "Take this to my mother," Amina begged. "She must know the truth." Zubaida's face darkened with worry. "If they catch me, they won't." Amina's voice trembled, but she forced strength into it. "I trust you." Zubaida hid the letter in the folds of her clothes and nodded. "I'll find a way." For the first time in weeks, Amina felt a spark of hope. If her mother received the message, she would come for her. Amina was sure of it. But as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, a dreadful thought gnawed at her mind. What if someone else found out first? What if the danger was closer than she thought? Farida sat by the window, lost in thought, when a faint knock on the door startled her. It was unusual for visitors to come at this hour. She opened the door hesitantly, only to find a veiled woman standing outside. Before she could speak, the woman swiftly pressed a small folded paper into her hand. From Amina, she whispered. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into the night. Farida's hands trembled as she unfolded the note. Mama, I did not leave. I was taken. Baba lied to you. Please find me. Her vision blurred with tears. Her worst fears were true. Amina hadn't gone abroad. She had been stolen from her. Her breath quickened as she stormed into the living room, where Ibrahim sat reading the newspaper as if life were normal. What have you done? She demanded, her voice shaking. Ibrahim barely glanced at her. What nonsense are you talking about now? She threw the letter onto his lap. Read it. His face remained unreadable as he skimmed through the words. Then, with a slow sigh, he folded the paper and set it aside. This changes nothing, he said, his voice cold. Amina is married now. She belongs to her husband. She belongs to no one. Farida's voice cracked with fury. You sold our daughter like a piece of property. Do you even realize what you've done? I did what was necessary, he snapped, his patience thinning. She will have a better life than we could ever give her. A better life in captivity. Farida's eyes burned with rage. You're a monster. Ibrahim stood, his expression darkening. Let it go, Farida. You cannot fight this. But he was wrong. She would fight with everything she had. That night, Farida packed a small bag and left the house, knowing she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, and she knew exactly where to find it. She sought out old friends, people who still believed in justice. Among them was Yusuf, a lawyer she had known for years. I need your help, she told him urgently. Yusuf read the letter, his expression grim. This is a serious accusation. If Amina has been forced into this marriage, we need proof. I will get proof, Farida vowed. Just tell me what to do. Yusuf nodded. Well, fight this. But be careful. People who do things like this don't give up their power easily. Farida's heart pounded. She had no doubt that the men who took Amina wouldn't let her go without a fight. But she was a mother, and nothing in this world could stop her from bringing her daughter home. Amina sat by the window, watching the moon cast silver light over the courtyard. She had spent weeks in this house, resisting, hating, and grieving the life that had been stolen from her. But one thing had begun to shift: her view of Hakim. He was not the cruel captor she had first imagined. He never forced her to speak, never demanded her obedience. Instead, he gave her space, treating her with quiet patience. And now, as she sat across from him in the dimly lit library, she finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. Why did you agree to this marriage? Hakim hesitated, setting down his book. Because I had no choice. Amina frowned. That's not an answer. He let out a slow breath. My father controls everything. This house, the business, the money. After my accident, he decided I was no longer fit to be his heir. He was ready to strip me of everything. Amina's heart clenched. So the only way to keep your inheritance was to marry me? Hakim nodded. He wanted me to prove I could still build a family, still be useful. Your father needed money. My father needed an obedient son. They struck a deal. Amina's fists clenched. So we were just transactions. I suppose we were. She looked at him then, really looked at him. His shoulders carried a weight of sorrow, his hands tense as if he carried an invisible burden. He had been trapped just like her. For the first time, she felt something other than resentment toward him. A fragile silence stretched between them before Hakim spoke again. If I could undo this, I would. Amina swallowed, her voice softer than before. So would I. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A truce. That night, Amina made a decision. She had been planning to escape alone, but now, for the first time, she considered another way. What if we both got out? She whispered. Hakim looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. You mean, I mean leaving this life behind? You don't want to be here any more than I do. For the first time since their wedding, he smiled. Just a little. It's a dangerous idea. But possible, she said, her heart racing. Hakim nodded. Possible. Just as hope began to bloom, the door creaked open. Amina turned, her blood running cold. A figure stood in the doorway, eyes gleaming in the darkness. They had been discovered. The night air was thick with tension as Amina crept through the dimly lit hallways, her heart pounding in her chest. Zubaida led the way, moving swiftly and silently, her years of service making her familiar with every hidden corner of the estate. This way, Zubaida whispered, pushing open a side door that led to the servants' quarters. The back gate isn't guarded at this hour. Amina's pulse raced. She was so close. Just a few more steps, and she would be free. She would find her mother. She would leave this nightmare behind. Then, the door swung open. Amina barely had time to react before rough hands grabbed her arms. She gasped, struggling, but the grip was too strong. Zubaida screamed as a guard shoved her to the ground. A slow, cruel clap echoed through the room. Well, well, Uncle Bashir sneered, stepping forward. Trying to run away, are we? Amina's stomach twisted. She had been caught. Behind Bashir, her father emerged, his face tight with anger. What have you done, Amina? What have you done? She shot back, her voice shaking. You sold me to these people. Her father's gaze faltered for a moment, but then his expression hardened. I did what was necessary, Bashir chuckled. And yet, the little bird still tries to fly. He knelt beside Zubaida, gripping her chin harshly. Traitors are punished, girl. Did you really think you could deceive us? Zubaida whimpered, but Amina screamed. Let her go. Bashir ignored her. His cold eyes flicked toward Amina's father. She's becoming a problem. We should get rid of her mother to make sure she behaves. Amina's breath caught in her throat. No, she whispered. Her father's face paled. That wasn't part of the plan. The plan has changed, Bashir cut him off. She needs to learn that disobedience has consequences. Before Amina could react, a voice rang out from the shadows. Enough. Hakim rolled into the room, his wheelchair cutting through the heavy silence. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm, sharp. Nothing like the quiet, patient man Amina had known. Uncle, he said coolly, you have no authority to make such decisions. Bashir's smirk faltered. And what do you plan to do about it, boy? Hakim wheeled closer, his eyes dark with power. You seem to have forgotten something. My father may control this house, but I control his wealth. Without me, you have nothing. A stunned silence filled the room. Bashir's confidence wavered, and Amina's father took a step back, looking between them. You were used, Ibrahim, Hakim continued, his voice softer now. Just like Amina. My uncle manipulated you into selling your own daughter. Are you proud of that? Amina's father swallowed hard. For the first time, she saw doubt, maybe even regret, in his eyes. But was it too late? Farida sat in the courtroom, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The air was thick with tension as the judge glanced over the documents before him. The room was packed. Reporters, activists, and members of the community had gathered to witness what had become a highly publicized case. She had fought relentlessly for this moment. The day she received Amina's letter, she had sworn that no matter what it took, she would bring her daughter home. Now, as the trial unfolded before her, she prayed justice would be served. Uncle Bashir stood before the court, his usual smugness replaced with unease. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records proving the exchange of money, testimonies from witnesses, and most importantly, Amina's own harrowing account of being forced into marriage. Your Honor, Farida's lawyer, Yusuf, spoke firmly. This is a clear case of coercion and illegal marriage. Amina was deceived, her rights stripped away. We demand that this injustice be corrected. The judge turned to Amina's father, Ibrahim, who stood beside his lawyer, his face lined with exhaustion. Do you deny these claims? The judge asked. Ibrahim hesitated. He had spent weeks denying the truth, trying to justify his actions, but as his eyes met Aminas, something inside him crumbled. "No," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deny it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Uncle Bashir, sensing his own downfall, tried to object. "This is absurd. The girl is lying. Enough." The judge's voice silenced him. He turned to the officers in the room. "Arrest Bashir Hassan for his role in this unlawful marriage and financial exploitation." 2 officers stepped forward, grabbing Bashir by the arms. He struggled, shouting curses, but his reign of control was over. Amina's father remained frozen in place. Though he would not face prison, his reputation was in ruins. Society would not forgive him for what he had done. The judge then looked at Amina. "You are hereby granted a legal divorce. You are free." Amina exhaled sharply, as if she had been holding her breath for weeks. Tears welled in her eyes. She turned to Hakim. He had been silent throughout the trial, watching it unfold with unreadable eyes. Now he gave her a small, sad smile. "You're free, Amina," he said softly. "That's all that matters." Despite everything, she felt a pang of sorrow. Hakim had been a victim too. He had been kind when he didn't have to be. She hesitated before whispering, "Thank you." He nodded, saying nothing more. The gavel struck. The case was over. Amina stepped forward and embraced her mother, sobbing into her arms. It was done. She was free. The morning sun bathed the small house in golden light as Amina stood outside, breathing in the fresh air of freedom. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she had control over her own destiny. No chains, no fear, just endless possibilities ahead. Farida stepped onto the porch, watching her daughter with tearful pride. "It still feels unreal, doesn't it?" Amina nodded, turning to face her mother. "I never thought I'd see this day." Farida cupped her face gently. "But you did. You fought and you won." They had spent weeks rebuilding their lives. The case had sparked a national conversation, bringing attention to the dark reality of forced marriages. Activists reached out, offering Amina support, while organizations dedicated to women's rights praised her courage. But for Amina, the greatest victory was reclaiming herself. One afternoon, she sat in the quiet corner of a library, flipping through legal textbooks. The fire in her heart burned brighter than ever. She would not let what happened to her be forgotten. She had made a decision. She would study law and fight for girls like her. Her suffering would not be in vain. One day, she received a letter. The handwriting was neat, familiar. "Amina, by now, you must be stepping into the life you always deserved. I wanted to say goodbye properly. I've left the city, seeking my own kind of freedom. Maybe one day our paths will cross again. Until then, I wish you nothing but happiness. Hakim." Amina ran her fingers over the words, a small smile forming on her lips. Hakim had been a stranger, a husband, a friend, and now, a memory of a life she had left behind. She whispered into the wind, "Goodbye, Hakim." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Amina stood tall, filled with new purpose. She had walked through fire, but she had come out stronger. This was her new dawn, and she was ready to change the world.